Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I believe we're the session before another break for lunch, so we appreciate everyone's attention, and this is one of the most important topics that we think at this conference today about strengthening humanitarian response. We're joined by a great panels here that really combines expertise in government, private sector, and NGO linking the two. As you may know, there's about 300 million people this year that are impacted by different humanitarian events. We've seen massive flooding in countries like Brazil, Afghanistan. We've seen, of course, major earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, huge conflicts like Russian war in Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan. There's no shortage of global crises, and all of our organizations collectively are working to address them. We have the panels here today. We're going to really try to go beyond the headlines and provide you with some actionable insights that your organizations can use to do more good around the world. So we're joined here today by Marcia Wong, who's the Deputy Assistant Administrator at the USAID Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. We have P&G Cloud Zakowski, who's Program Director for Global Disaster Relief Program, and Steve Smith, who's the CEO and President of Airlink. We really want to get into the discussion today by looking at some of these global risks. In 2024, the Global Risk Report from the World Economic Forum identified a few really key disabler's that we see. So these growing conflicts, extreme weather, social discontent, polarization, and then also structural forces that are underlying them. So climate change, demographic bifurcation, geopolitical shifts, and technological acceleration. So what we'd like to ask the panelists to start us off is, how are your organizations assessing these global risks, threats, and challenges as they relate to your humanitarian mission? And also, what are playing out right now in humanitarian terms for 2024? So we'll start with Marcia from USAID.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for your attention today. Even as Jennifer was speaking, I could feel more white hair like popping out of my head right now. So bear with me on this, because I probably will leave the stage with a couple more. But again, the backdrop that Jennifer painted is a tough and challenging one for the humanitarian, if I may, the architecture writ large, and certainly for USAID and the bureau that I represent, and also the responsibility of being at this moment the largest humanitarian donor, bilateral donor in the world, comes with those responsibilities. And if there's one thing, if I can ask you to hold in your mind when I speak to the work that we are trying to do, we are about influencing, we are about leveraging, and we are about prospecting. So please hold those three action verbs in your mind. If I can add some more fast facts to the context that we're working in, and it's sobering, but it does not mean that we step back from it. If anything, it means we step forward and together in this space. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, a partner of BHA, sent out its latest report on internal displacement at 75.9 million people. That has doubled in the last 5 years. We're projected at another 140 million people by 2030 in need of humanitarian assistance. There is a $41 billion funding gap. This is also against what Jennifer described as natural disasters, which increasing frequency, severity, they know no boundaries, they know no calendar, they certainly don't respect a budget planning cycle, and I'll get into the resource side of that. Then protracted crisis, the compounding effect of climate and conflict, some of these new trends and challenges emerging in these spaces that humanitarians and private sector have to work with, the application of artificial intelligence. In one place, a drone may be providing medical care, malaria tablets in Goma. In another place, if a drone's flying over your head, the person on the ground is going to try to shoot it down. Authoritarianism, demographics, so a multitude of these trends, and what it requires of the humanitarian organization is to understand, analyze these, and for the humanitarian implications. Resources. It is a shrinking space in terms of the resources that are coming forward from the bilateral donors. I would like to thank you as U.S. taxpayers and our Congress for providing a supplemental this year. If I can just give you, just from USAID's perspective, where we've been in the budget trajectory, but then think about all those other donors out there who are coming in a lot less. So we were lucky, and again, thank you, all of you, taxpayers. $12 billion was the operating budget for USAID BHA in 22. Buoyed, regrettably, by the food insecurity that Congress said we have to address famine. Ukraine. 23 dropped to about 9.8 for us, and then 24 we were walking in with almost a 50% cut. And when the biggest donor in the world had to almost cut by 50%, the reverberation of that was going to be massive. And we saw UN agencies, international non-governmental organizations that work in the humanitarian space contract massively. But the needs are just doing this. Now with this supplemental of 9 billion plus, some going to the State Department's Populations, Refugee Migration Bureau, 5.6 billion coming to us, we are back up in, again, about $9–10 billion. This sounds wonderful, but if it's up against these funding gaps of a projected 41 billion, drop in bucket. So again, what do we do in terms of the influencing within this space, the leveraging of what we have, and the prospecting? So if I can move you into all of these, if I may, external pressure points on the humanitarian system now, and speaking from where we are as the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, we undertook a fairly massive internal look. And it's hard when you're just in motion and you're responding day to day, like my colleagues do too, to step back and say, we have got to do this better and different and more effectively. None of this will be unfamiliar to you, but what I want to stress is that there's an intentionality and a stronger focus on to be as strategic and as effective as one can be. So when I describe these 5 pillars, you might go, yeah, but there's intentionality, there's focus, and again, through all these pillars I'm going to describe to you, partnership, the influencing, the leveraging, the prospecting, partnership, and the locally led humanitarian action runs through it all. First pillar, rapid onset. You know, it's those floods, it's the hurricanes, we have data, we'll talk about that more. How do we predict, how do we prepare? The second one is, you know, protracted crisis. It's a different contextual, it's long-term planning. Who are the actors, including the private sector, that have to be in that space with us? The third is when we start moving out of the protracted crisis, and it's a start-stop, we know, but then it's the recovery, it's the resilience. And again, private sector, walking that with us, being there already with us. The fourth is the influencing. I'm talking as USAID, BHA to you now, but they're a huge architecture of humanitarian response around the world. Global, multinational, multilateral, local. So how do we influence in that to convene, to coalesce, to make sure it's effective and not fragmented? And the fifth is partnership, again, the thread that runs through all of this. It's global, local, it's partnership with development, it's partnership with peace builders, and it certainly is partnership with private sector. The USAID administrator referred to the private sector engagement as being at the heart of the business of this agency today. And it gives me special pleasure to be up on the stage here with Stephen. I'm not going to steal too much of your thunder, but let me just have a little bit of a brag moment. Airlink was critical when the cholera was emerging in Haiti. And Haiti is one of those crises that is not grabbing enough of the headlines. Sudan, the Gazas, the Ukraines. But there were regrettably tens of these crises and conflicts. This one is gang violence. It's not in state armed groups. But cholera was breaking out, and we recognized with all the fragility of that state, if we did not contain cholera, the ability for it to spread to other islands it was a dramatic moment for us in the government. I sent down a disaster assistance response team like October 2022. But Airlink was a critical element in bringing together, and Stephen, I hope you'll elaborate more, bringing together commercial aviation and logistics suppliers, and then over the course of weeks, what was it, 290 tons over 38 flights and a humanitarian air bridge out of Miami to Port-au-Prince. It was a critical moment for us to address this, and I want to thank Airlink, but that is a crystal example of partnership moving fast with us to respond as effectively and strategically as we can. So thank you.
Right, well, thank you so much, Marcia. And moving to P&G, we all know all the wonderful products that P&G provides, but it's really amazing to see how P&G is able to respond to these crises and set up, laundry centers or portable restrooms. So I'd love to hear how P&G is assessing the current global risks, and how do you choose where you're focusing your efforts?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for having me. P&G is a global consumer products company. We have operations in about 70 countries around the world. So we are continually assessing and evaluating how we can best respond to a number of crises around the world. We're really guided by three principles. One is protecting our employees, the second is serving our consumers, and the third is supporting communities. And I'm very fortunate that that's the area that I get to spend my time doing at the company, which is working with partners, many of whom are in the room, to determine how we can most effectively respond to natural disasters and humanitarian crises around the world. So we obviously do this with financial support, but I think where we're most uniquely positioned is in the products we make. Because after people's basic needs have been met, food, water, shelter, it's all the other daily essentials that people look to. They need diapers, they need femcare supplies, soap, shampoo, razors, deodorant. It's these things that people use every day that help give them a sense of normalcy, help them throughout the recovery, rebuilding process. So we work with organizations to pre-position and to make sure that we're getting those products where they're needed, when they're needed. The other thing we've done is expand into bringing services to communities. So Tide Loads of Hope is a program that's widely known here in the US. We started that after Hurricane Katrina. We've actually grown and evolved that program. We started with 1 truck. We now have 3. It gives us the agility and the ability to go to more places, even at the same time if we need to. We've entered into a partnership with Walmart to develop shower and restroom trailers. The same principle is we can bring these into communities when there's a lack of electricity, water, and give residents and responders access to these services. And we've replicated the Loads of Hope model. It's not just in the US. We've used it in countries around the world following the earthquakes in Morocco and Turkey. And when we can't bring trucks to certain places, like following the wildfires in Maui, we've worked with local laundromats to enable us to provide these free services free to the residents in that particular area. One of our biggest initiatives that is purely on the international is our Children's Safe Drinking Water program. We have a water purification technology that takes really dirty, contaminated water from any natural source and turns it into clean drinking water in 30 minutes. And we've been able to utilize this technology and distribute it in more than 100 countries around the world, working with more than 150 partner organizations over the years. And it's uniquely suited to be used in emergencies because it's easy to be transported. You can use it with very simple things like a bucket, a stick, and a cloth. We pre-position this around the world. We're using it today in response to the Brazil floods. We've used it in Malawi with the recent cholera outbreaks. So it's a way that we can leverage an innovation and a technology to help do good in the world.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Claudette. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce and U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, we know the incredibly important role that the private sector provides. But if we can't get that aid to the end user, how good is it? And that's where Airlink comes in, really redefining the paradigm for supply chains and logistics in the aid business. So Steve, love to hear how you're assessing these global risks, and tell us a little bit more about your company.
Sure, thanks so much, and it's great to see everybody, and it's great to see so many partners here. So Airlink is a 501c3 organization. We are a market-based solution, and we connect NGOs with transportation providers to move passengers, relief workers, and also cargo relief supplies. We don't have any of our own planes, so we leverage airline networks from all around the world. All of the airlines that we all flew on, maybe some of us flew on to get here today, we pull those together to help move NGOs. 200 NGOs we partner with, 50 airlines worldwide, and in 2023 we supported programs to deliver aid to over 12 million people. And the organization's really focused on two sort of sobering statistics. 73% 73% of all humanitarian aid budgets go to some portion of the supply chain, which is pretty crazy, right? And transportation is a significant portion of that. The second statistic, 60%, is that oftentimes when aid is sent into after a disaster, it's either the wrong aid or it's sent at the wrong time. So you can imagine how much of a clog that becomes in the system. And so really we're focused on delivering the right aid at the right time to the right place. In terms of how we're assessing the risks, Airlink's model has changed over time. Humanitarian events are clearly on the rise and they become more protracted. We're very much focused on, as I'm sure we'll all agree, empowering local communities to inform our responses. And we do that through deliberate selection of our NGO partners, make sure they're vetted. NGOs pay nothing to be part of Airlink, by the way. That's a service we provide to them to help move these things. And it's really about bringing resources and capabilities globally to help support those local communities. Now, conflict is a major driver of humanitarian need. We're all aware of that. We're seeing the news every day. Interestingly, pre-pandemic, Airlink really didn't respond to any conflict-related events. But now you look at our biggest 5 programs, ongoing programs, are in Gaza, are in Sudan, Haiti, Afghanistan, and Ukraine. And while there are many similarities across those disasters compared to natural disasters, access to shelter, food, medical care, clean water, you also see, and we can see on the news, there are increased and additional risks for safety and security of people that are operating there. There are also heavy geopolitics that are at play, which certainly turn up in natural disasters as well, but in a big way for conflicts. Even in climate-related emergencies, and given the economic challenges that the NGO community faces in terms of fundraising, getting support, plus added to that is that a lot of disasters that are in the media take attention away from some other things that are happening elsewhere, right? And so it's increasingly difficult to resource the things that you think that can really make an impact and address some of the biggest situations. I was last week in Geneva at the UN Humanitarian Partnerships Week, and I was speaking with a friend who has, I have one friend, and he has 40 years of experience in the humanitarian sector, and he was lamenting how, many organizations that used to be developmental in focus have now shifted to response, right? And at the same time, all the work that he had done, he and his colleagues at the time had done in the 80s and 90s, had all been undone by these massive spike events that we've experienced, these conflicts, COVID, and I think that's right when you look at the COVID pandemic, 2014-15, and then or not COVID, Ebola, and then you look at COVID. It's not just those situations that impacted us. It destroyed healthcare systems all around the world and brought down infrastructure. So yet we still have to respond, and we do and play a key role in mobilizing the private sector. And it's really all about, or Airlink is really all about bringing that market-based solution to support humanitarian relief. That doesn't mean it's free of charge. There are costs, but it is a sectoral approach that really leverages the capabilities across the world. I'll give you an example that an organization we worked with, Care Australia, had cyclone relief supplies from India, but they had no way to get them to ultimately Tonga. Now, we had a relationship with Korean Airlines that we were able to provide support to get those supplies from India to Australia. Then some good partners, DHL, helped us repackage those, put them in smaller planes, and then Fiji Airways flew them the last leg. And so building partnerships in advance is with airlines and logistics companies for us is tremendously powerful. It's really focused on addressing that 73% cost of all humanitarian programs. And we can act as a consolidator, find solutions where there aren't any, and it's really important. But to one of Marsha's points about focus, the Global Humanitarian Overview for 2024 states that There are less people going to be targeted for humanitarian intervention in 2024 than in 2023, but yet there are more people that are in need this year than there were last year. So that means that the humanitarian sector is realizing we can't do everything, we can't be everything to everyone, so we really need to focus. And I think that that's a key area that the humanitarian sectors focus on, and that's what Airlink's doing too.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And building on all your remarks and stepping back, every humanitarian crisis is unique. Every disaster is unique. Flood, fire, conflict, looking at the geographic and also demographic impacts. But in terms of developing recommendations that we can use to strengthen humanitarian response before, during, and after conflicts, are there certain things you can draw, Marcia had mentioned on the budget side, that we can try to galvanize support either through governments or private sector NGO community?
May I?
Yes, please.
Okay, if I can kick off on that one. And thanks, Stephen, for the more white hair. But if I can stress a little bit on the before, and this gets into the preparedness and the anticipatory action agenda. But it is, if we can do our homework on the conflict dynamics, mapping the local capacity there, mapping with all of you what you have, what you're present. Thank you for the warehouses. Having these conversations early. A disaster, again, with the severity, El Nino, La Nina, we know weather patterns are taking place. We've invested hundreds of millions, 650 million over the past decade or so into early warning systems. We were partnering with NASA, NOAA, World Meteorological, United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction, data analytics, predictive forecasting, all of that. And how do we drive it quickly into the hands of those who are going to be responding? And so the real-time response of moving this data out continues to be a challenge. I think I can probably provide everybody in this room some data, and you will adjust accordingly. But when I put it on a small national disaster management agency in the Pacific Islands, and they don't even have the capacity to analyze it, I'm giving them tools, but then what to do with it. And so you can imagine the frustration that occurs that we haven't built up the analytics side of our partners to understand the data that we're dumping on them. So it's these other unintended consequences of sharing capacity that we have to be very, very conscious of what gaps we may be creating when we do provide tools. So again, if I can put that emphasis on before. Supply chain management and logistics, as you said, Stephen, huge amounts of the cost. So again, as humanitarian organizations, and there's logs, clusters, and that, but again, the sharing of knowledge of best practices, different skill sets, interoperability of systems, data dashboards that we feel comfortable sharing with each other. The greening, and I have to tiptoe that one in. USAID is a supporter of the Environmental and Humanitarian Charter. 350 organizations have signed up to this. We are moving things out through air and other means, but we also recognize the impact that can have on these communities when we drop our materials there, we leave things behind. So there's also knowing that, how do we prepare in a better way that actually leaves a community stronger and greener, if I can put that there. The one thing I also wanted to stress to all of you is, again, the local capacity angle of it. We recognize at AID, we are a big bureaucracy. Anybody here who's had to partner with us knows that it can be quite cumbersome. But we are irresponsible if we at the same time are not responding to the people who feel the effects the most. And it is those frontline communities. And we are working diligently, writ large as an agency, but certainly within BHA on, even if it's rapid onset, we should know who's there, be it the National Society of the International Federation of the Red Cross Red Crescent, be it a women-led civil society organization that helps with hygiene products to the local community. We should know who's there. And Stephen, even if they are working in the development lane, can they pivot into the humanitarian lane with us? Mm-hmm. If we can keep these organizations, including small business, being part of the, kind of the product line, moving goods back into the community, if we know that and we can strengthen them, then after a disaster takes place, then we're into the recovery stage, they're at a higher base to build back on, rather than having the erosion take place because we didn't do our homework.
Great, well, thank you so much. And please, Claude, jump right in.
Yeah, I'm going to reiterate a lot of what you said. We spend a lot of time before building partners partnerships, listening to our partners of what's needed, how we can best prepare. We're obviously not a response organization, but we work with those that know how to effectively and efficiently respond. And so much of that is just being prepared, both at the national level and the local level. We've developed relationships over the years in local places where we know there's a high probability, high frequency of disasters. Because as you know, getting things from point A to point B is not always simple, especially in times of crisis and disaster. So we've learned to develop new networks, new partners, so that we can pre-position things in communities, in regions that we can access very quickly, and we can get into the places where they're needed. And so we're really grateful for those partners that we have, and for those systems that we've put in place, because the bottom line is we want to be able to respond and get resources where they're needed as quickly as possible.
That's great.
Great.
I think for me, strengthening humanitarian action, I think it's a bit of a conundrum that we're faced with, right? How do you bring in funding for responses without just chasing the headlines of the big responses? And we all agree, we've all just said responses must be locally informed, and that's why, as an organization, Airlink, we're being selective with our partners, with our NGO partners, and we're focusing on where we can really make an impact. But I would say that unfortunately the humanitarian sector is very fragmented and it's very competitive. And I think one of the things I think would be good for organizations to ask themselves, nonprofit organizations, private sector as well, is are we really adding value here? Are we really adding value and making an impact to this response? Something we've adopted is and it's not perfect, but a decision matrix around, okay, do we have the resources to respond? Can we make a material impact? What would happen if we didn't respond? Is there enough of a delta? And so if the answer to some of those questions is no, then maybe we just shouldn't play. That doesn't mean we don't care, that doesn't mean we don't want to support, but we can't do everything and be everything to everyone. And I think from a perspective of how businesses can engage, it's pretty straightforward, but sometimes you just need to be reminded of this. Know your partners in advance, right? Don't try and reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of great organizations out there that already have systems and structures in place. Invest in those systems. And I think, please don't put up big reporting and administrative hurdles that detracts from the work that they're trying to execute on. Try and have those conversations in advance. But also think about staying focused. I remember back 2014-15 for our Ebola response to West Africa, we had a big donor that came in, nobody on the stage. We had a big donor that came in and was very focused and helped us set up the first air bridge from the US to West Africa, and it's a tremendous success. We went back to them, and it was widely recognized that we weren't prepared. We need to do better as a community for logistics. We went back to them and said, hey, can we build this for the future? And they said, well, no, sorry, we're now going to focus on the homeless population in a big city in the US. And that's great. But the thing is that now, fast forward, we've had this pandemic, COVID, and what was that? That was a logistical problem, right? That was, how do we get these KN95 masks? How do we get the vaccines around the world? And so having some consistency in focus can really help, I think, make a difference, as opposed to, being sort of pot shot around different places. But I would end on one of the most difficult things for us is when you sit back and you look at all the responses that we're active in, is there are some responses that are really so bad and they're not in the news. These are like Sudan, these are like Afghanistan. And the problem is there's very little interest, there's very little donor interest, and all NGOs are struggling to respond to those. That doesn't mean we don't care, and we are responding to the big ones in the news, Gaza, Ukraine. But these other major humanitarian events really are getting no focus and support. And so when you think about where can we make the most impact, that's probably it. However, it's so funding starved. So that's a real tough one. But either way, it's important to build these relationships in advance.
Yeah, there's such an important emphasis on the before. And the window of time that we have to impact the during and then moving into stabilization, of course, is very different. But as we look at some of these lessons learned from these partnerships, and how do you see humanitarian organizations becoming more agile and developing collaborative partnerships, specifically looking at climate change and climate risks with vulnerable populations?
May I? Great, thank you. I really appreciate the word that you use in terms of agile. And the exercise of prioritization, if I can call it that, and thank you, Stephen, for mentioning the humanitarian overview. With the needs growing and the resource base coming from traditional donors shrinking, it's asking all of us to make those hard decisions. And when you do talk to a counterpart in a UN agency or an INGO or a local business person saying, I was used to providing 100 meals to 100 families, and now you're asking me to provide 10 meals to 10 families, what about the other 90 now? And that gets to that building resilience part. It's like, have we not done our job in any way to graduate people from needing these meals into being able to cook them themselves? That's a very, very simple story there, and I think that's where the partnership comes in. And again, we're a humanitarian bureau, but all our conversations are more and more assertively and aggressively with development actors, with the private sector, with the conflict prevention and the peace-building communities, because I feel like we can be there. We've been there. We're probably going to be there, and regrettably, we may still be there afterwards. But it's like we're helping clear a little bit of this runway, and we need the private sector and the development to come in this runway also, bringing resources, technical assistance, and just be willing to share that knowledge and help lift these communities. There's there's a world of, for lack of a better way to describe them, the forgotten crises. For us at BHA, we're, yes, huge amounts of attention. We have 4 what we call response teams stood up. There are presence out in the field on Levant. We have teams in Cairo, in Jordan, in Israel, in Sudan, Afghanistan, Ukraine. These are our big ones, but regrettably, we have 40 different offices around the world, pre-POD warehouses in other regions, because there are such things that we refer to as steady state crisis. That distresses me to have to say those words in the same sentence, that they are crisis in steady state. And so we can keep doing this, but it's like, no, shrink the need, talk to these other partners, drive their resources in, have a shared goal of, yes, BHA's mission statement is life-saving, alleviate suffering, and build resilience. But we definitely have a shared goal with the private sector of, we want to protect your market, we want to protect your consumer, we want to protect your supply chains, and livelihoods. We share those goals. I don't think it's difficult for us to be in that same room to recognize we may be coming from it from different perspectives, but there is a shared objective here. Eventually, at the end of the day, it's the communities in need. If I can pivot a little bit to climate, because BHA, we're a humanitarian bureau, but we are also a climate bureau. I have it on a t-shirt somewhere in my office. We talked a lot about preparedness and anticipatory action, and then the actual response. But we know there are communities living in the here and now of climate shock. And when it's compounded by other fragility, weak governance systems, authoritarianism, conflict, it's just a double vulnerability for them. We're trying to swing climate resources to these communities to have to adapt to these shocks. A challenge to my bureau, and I'm going to put it out in front of all of you to help us be creative in this. We committed at last COP to put up to 5 years, up to $200 million to help communities with adaptation needs. It is really hard to bring our money directly down into local organizations. But Stephen, I promise you, we are working our best to clear that runway of those bureaucratic suitcases are piled up on top of it. The second phase, moving out to put more resources out. The first phase was 60 million. The second phase, can't tell you yet. But I need to be more creative and think of the partnering that can come in. If there's a local organization that can do this and this, but doesn't have the analytics to do monitoring and oversight, what private sector can help with skill sets and skill building? So I want to crowd in technical expertise. I want to crowd in resources. We can trigger a little bit, and this is leveraging now. How can our money create more resources for these communities? So watch this space in the second phase of this. We would like your innovation. We would like your ideas on how to do this in a way that's more inclusive keeping the communities at the center, but more inclusive with those who want to help respond. So thank you for allowing me that moment, Jennifer.
Great, thank you so much, Marcia. I think you've given us a lot of really great food for thought, especially on the technological side and what type of programs and toolkits that we can create for vulnerable communities. Claude, I'd love to hear from you and how P&G sees some of the lesson learned of how communities can be helped in the climate space.
Yes, thanks. You know, I think everyone can relate to the fact that we are just seeing the needs increase more and more, especially these vulnerable communities. And the challenge really is there are the big disasters that everybody is responding to, and there are the ones that people aren't as familiar with. The Afghanistan, the Sudan. We've been supporting Sudan, and I personally believe that if we're going to play in the disaster relief space and have a program and a commitment to this, that we're going to help address as many of these as we can, even in areas where, you know, we have no business, we have no operations, but there's still an important need. And I think our partners help keep us honest. They come to us and they tell us, you know, here's an area, it's not getting a lot of attention, but, you know, they're in desperate need of clean water. And so the answer is always, I'll see what we can do. So we want to partner with others, and we want to be in places where, you know, our resources can be used and where they're needed.
Great, thank you. And Steve.
Well, I think that, you know, we're all agreed that preparedness and planning and connecting in advance is really important. At this point, we know who the most vulnerable populations are. We know, certainly from a climate perspective, we understand the trends that affect weather patterns like hurricane seasons, monsoon seasons. And so for Airlink, we've identified and vetted and are working with NGOs and also training their logisticians to prepare them to respond. And they're either local organizations, local NGOs, or they are international organizations that are supporting those local organizations. Then for us, it's the key discussion is with the stakeholders. Who are the coordination bodies, the airlines, the logistics companies, donors, to really provide a dynamic response capability, not talking about, oh, what might we do if this happens, but actually saying, what will we do? Where are the supplies going to come from? How can we support? You know, especially we have a big investment in for us in the Asia Pacific region, and thinking about the complex geographies of all those island chains of trying to get supplies to. And even though our name is Airlink, it would imply we mostly operate on airplanes, and that's true. We will also get involved, and we have gotten more involved in other modalities, so whether it's ships or whether it could be ground transportation. But one of the things that Marcia mentioned earlier, we had a great dynamic relationship with BHA. They had, and I appreciate her vision and their vision, we had a pre-arrangement that we would have funding to support responses in and around hurricane season. Now, the hurricane season didn't materialize, thankfully, as we might have expected, but then the cholera epidemic did in Haiti, and we were able to have that flexibility to reprogram those funds and set up that air bridge that helped a tremendous amount of people, tremendous amount of organizations that supported dozens of NGOs, UN agencies as well. And so, and we provided a common service for supplies to get there over a number of months. And so, you know, engagements like that and flexibility, it can really make a difference.
Great, well, thank you. I think you've provided us a lot of really good insights on how companies and organizations can have better preparation through partnerships and really looking beyond the headlines at different conflicts where you can have an impact. This budget flexibility and agility is so important. And I wanted to just dig deeper a little bit on that. Like, what are the dynamics, Marcia, if USAID has, depending on the calendar year, let's say, how does that work? We know hurricane season's coming, but when these unexpected events happen, how is, you know, U.S. government able to surge in different support?
I think it's important to recognize that it's a given, that it's not an if, it's a when. Again, one hopes with all the investments that we've made in early warning systems, we're very much in support of the Secretary General's early warning for all, that we have some heads up on floods, we have some heads up on hurricanes, that we can move quickly, and again, building on the investments that have been made. So here's for instance, hurricanes in the Asia Pacific, Philippines, we're seeing it coming. We're managing what they call the managed retreat from the more vulnerable coastal areas. What was wonderful to see when, we're standing by as BHA for our ambassador in consultation with the foreign ministry and the natural disaster responders, civilian authorities in the Philippines, when they don't send a cable or there's not a phone call in that first 24 hours because they've got it, the Philippine civilian authorities have it, to me it's like, a moment of success, because the years of investment into their capacities, the data getting out to them ahead of time, their ability to do a managed retreat from shoreline, I can sleep that night, but that's not always the case. That's really not always the case, because we know that investments in capacity is uneven. It takes a coup, it takes conflict, it takes, regrettably, a natural disaster or a man-made disaster that can wipe away those capacities. So we have, over the years, have built a response fund, and we try to keep it well augmented with resources, because when there is a Pakistan flood that covered almost 2/3 of the country, we were able to mobilize $100 million in that first stage of response, and that came out of this response fund. But is it a well that runs that deep all the time? No, of course not. So at the same time, the emphasis on keep investing in that capacity, that you cannot not do that nowadays.
Very good. I'm curious to hear how your organizations respond when you're tapped out, but you need to help.
Oh, sorry, that was.
How are your organizations respond when you're kind of working on all cylinders in other areas, but you see a major crisis and you may not have the budget, but you want to respond?
Yeah, with tremendous difficulty. I mean, it's very challenging because I think as I see it, we had for humanitarian organizations, we had during Ukraine and then COVID. Significant funding across the board. That's not the same situation we're in right now. Funding's much lower, things are much harder. And so we really need to think about prioritizing those resources, and that's where we get to this decision matrix as to, can we really make a material difference, right? We all, and so I think it's fighting that urge to have to respond to everything. Really easy to say yes, really hard to say no.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's really all about prioritization, because the demand has been for years outstripping the supply in terms of funding, and there will never be enough funding, I don't think. It doesn't matter, and so we need to figure out different ways, and I think the folks in this room can really play a massive part in that to sort of add another element, not just, hey, we need more funding, but how to bring the commercial sector in to use the skill sets that they have.
Yeah,
So
I
the
think
power
there's
of partnerships.
a lot of opportunity to bring together partners, even partnerships that aren't obvious. As a private company, we're happy to partner with other private companies. I mean, we're open to working together because I think there's a lot of power in that collaboration and joining forces and resources together. We can do more. So.
Wonderful.
One more note?
Please.
If I can have one more note, and I'm going to take you back to my action verbs about the influencing and the leveraging, the prospecting for partners. So drive attention to those. But it's that leveraging, and thank you all for recognizing individually we're all scrambling to do good, but where are those comparative advantages, and recognizing that and championing those, like, you can do that better than we, let us direct our attention elsewhere. The UN Connecting Business Initiative is a good example, something that we support at the UN level. 16 local business associations around the world, 275,000 local businesses are networked with information sharing, knowledge sharing, best practices. It's these places that exist, so don't spend too much energy creating the new unless it's going to be a total game changer. But what exists, can we leverage it better and smarter? So please, but on the prospecting, let us know. Let us know what you see on the ground that deserves to be leveraged, and let's see how we can work on that together. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. And definitely, we should all keep in touch with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation and continue to work with our strong partners here and in the audience because we know that the power of partnerships will help us be more agile to respond to so many of these humanitarian crises. So I want to thank you all for your insights and thank everybody for your attention here today.